if we can get started from someone from EW. Okay. Thanks, Lila. I love you. Appreciate it. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for Live Now, Video's Next Wave. And I have with us someone virtual from Los Angeles. She wasn't able to join us in person, but I'm glad she was able to join us via Skype. Jen Deng. We also have, so Jen is a VR director and the co-founder of Shift and Women in VR. With us we have, right next to me, Stephanie Engel. She's a product designer working on VR, 360, and Live at Facebook. Her recent projects include Live 360 Video and Facebook's first VR app for Samsung Gear. Also with us, we have Cassandra Herman. She's an Emmy-nominated filmmaker who is producing immersive journalism experiences for Emblematic Group. That was founded by virtual reality pioneer Noni de la Peña. Cassandra recently co-directed After Solidarity. It's a VR experience that premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival, and it won the jury award for Room Scale VR. Also with us, we have Zaha Rasool. She's currently part of the Al Jazeera innovation team and currently the editorial lead for The Scene. She was previously managing editor of the Huffington Post Riot and the founder of Gistery in 2015. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but yesterday we had some major announcements. One from Facebook. And so I wanted to start the questions for the major announcements and then ease into the other questions. So yesterday, Facebook Live announced that they're going into 360. And there's been a lot of talk during the day from the different panels about how either you're building your brand or doing some sort of content building with Facebook Live. And so I wanted to reach out and first start off the panel question with Stephanie and kind of get an idea of what was the anticipation of this Facebook Live 360, the audience that they were gearing towards, and what are they anticipating for the next few months of who's going to be using the 360 in that realm.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. So as far as like the anticipation for Live 360 and why, we've decided to invest in it. So we actually launched Live 360 back in December, starting with a handful of publishers, including National Geographic was our launch partner. But yesterday's announcement was really rolling that out to the world. So anyone with the right equipment can go Live 360. And I think our investment in this is like twofold. One is, Facebook tends to be a company where like we try and skate where the puck is going. And so I think like people are still trying to figure out what to do with Live, let alone Live 360. But we do believe that Live 360 and spatial audio and all these sorts of things are going to be the future of this like journalism, especially this like citizen journalism and documentation. I think the other thing, like the other point about like what are we anticipating people do with this? Honestly, I'm looking forward to just seeing how people surprise us. I don't think anyone really knows quite what the killer use case is for 360 yet, but we're figuring out sort of together. Certain things I've seen are like citizen journalism has been like super interesting so far. So I've already seen someone did a Live 360 of like a crime kind of scene happening, and nothing much was happening. But you can imagine that being able to experience these sorts of events with no filter on time or space enables this sort of truth and interesting type of immersion that other media formats can't or cannot already afford. So I think those are kind of it. It's like one is this like innovation thread, and the other is like just enabling new types of storytelling and capture that puts people more at the scene of what you're doing.
So as you noted that news outlets were using the live format to kind of gauge how it's going to work or how their voice or how they were going to approach it. What's the feedback from the other panelists as well from what you've seen, the content that has been created, and what do you think should be the future of this live 360 format going forward now that it's more available to the everyday consumer? Zahar, do you want to take an approach?
So we've been talking to Facebook to do our first Live 360. We haven't experimented with Live 360 yet, but we have a shoot coming up in 3 weeks, which we're hoping to take the camera and do our first Live 360 from a refugee camp. And I guess we'll know more about how audiences feel about that. I do think it's an interesting feature just because so much of 360 video right now is almost all of it is show and tell. Where you're sticking the camera and you're able to experience a location. So the live feature will add more to a news story if you are doing live out of a protest or out of some interesting location or event. For audiences to be able to experience that in live and to be able to see what's happening in real time, I think it's going to add more to news delivery.
Cassandra, do you have any?
I feel similarly. I mean, I think there's so much content when it comes to 360 video. It feels a little overwhelming and saturated at the moment. So I think for the prospects of breaking news and putting you right in the middle of events globally and at a level where citizens can sort of not control those stories, but have some ownership over them, I think is really exciting. Yeah.
Can you kind of talk more about that, the work at Emblematic that you're doing and the work that Noni de la Pena has been doing as well, about creating that experience where people can actually be immersed in it?
Well, I wouldn't say that you don't. I think 360 is actually can be very, very immersive. I think it's just a different kind of experience. So Emblematic Group, Noni de la Pena is the founder of the company, and she really specializes in immersive storytelling and in room scale or walk-around VR experiences where you're wearing the headset and you can actually move in, let's say, a 10 by 10 or 11 by 11 space. And so for me, as I come from a traditional documentary journalism background, and I got involved in this work because it was so exciting to think of taking some of these social issue subjects and experiencing them in a way that felt it's a sense of embodiment or presence, that you could actually inhabit the space and in a way inhabit the story in a totally new way. And so that's what Emblematic specializes in, and using kind of very cutting edge technology. So something called photogrammetry, which is where you take photoreal images of an environment, of a room, and then you sort of build out that environment so that you can actually stand in it. And then volumetric capture, which is where you interview someone, like a green screen environment from every sort of angle, full 360, so that you end up with a hologram of that person. And then you relocate the hologram into that environment. And that's what we just did for this piece, After Solitary, which is a collaboration with Frontline, the documentary series. And it's just a totally different way to experience, I think, the issue of criminal justice reform or solitary confinement, because you are in this cell with a former inmate talking to you and telling you his story. So that's some idea of what they do.
And I know when I spoke with Zahar earlier as well, so Al Jazeera has more of the hard news media outlet. Now that you're building and doing more work with Al Jazeera, thinking of the content they're going to be creating this year, what are some things that you're going to put into consideration when you're trying to find or create that story in 360?
So I joined the company in February, so I'm very new to working with an Al Jazeera. I was with Riot before that and actually worked with Jen. That's how we know each other. And I also worked with, yeah. But the goal that we have is we definitely want to be able to do the more immersive storytelling like the way Cassandra mentioned, but our main mandate is how can we equip the newsroom to be able to do more 360 video. We have bureaus all over the world, and we want our journalists to be trained and proficient enough to go to a location or while they're doing a story, think about it in terms of 360 video also. So while we will be doing a lot of the high-end immersive storytelling using photogrammetry and volumetric for the VR headset, we, at least for this year and the next year, what we're focusing on is how do we democratize 360 video? And how can we, how can we train our journalists to be able to take these cameras to wherever they're going, and if the story merits it, how can we scale the 360 production and 360 storytelling?
And for the women on the panel, we talk a lot about designing for the headset, and then I think it's important to talk about designing for mobile as now that, Facebook, you have Facebook Live in 360, and then there's also been lots of outlets and lots of content that we're seeing in 360 on these social media platforms. Do you put that into consideration for the content that you're creating? Is that changing any element?
Like if you're going to vigorously move the camera, there's certain camera movements that actually work really well in 360 video, just viewing it on mobile and being able to spin around, and it's not, what's the word? It doesn't make you disoriented at all, but if you were to ever put that in a headset, like it will make someone nauseous. So even just from a technical perspective, you definitely have to kind of keep in mind, like, where are my final deliverables going? Where are people going to view this content the most? At least from approaching it in that way.
Stephanie?
Yeah, so it's funny because I think about all this from the other perspective, which is less about how do you make the content work for the platform and how do you make I think about how do you make the platform work for the content. And so, most people, when they think of VR or content for VR like 360, they think of the headset, whereas actually like most of the world does not have headsets. And so a lot of what my team thinks about are experiences like how do you design 360 videos and immersive content for emerging markets and devices that can't even really support like gyroscopic movements where you can move your phone around and look at the content. So yeah, a lot of my work and some of the most exciting work I think that I do is how do you make immersive content satisfying on devices that people have today. And I think you can interpret that as like a niche goal, like as in like we're trying to do something that's like super specialized and perhaps that's not as important. But I've actually found that like being on the other side of it and inside of what's going on, it's making like everything better. Like, so it's not just pushing a new format, but it's pushing like the way that Facebook, for example, works currently now. And like we're encouraging other video teams to reapproach how they use their products. So I think like my prediction is that this transition period that we're in right now, where people are not fully in immersive devices, I'm actually not convinced that everyone will end up having headsets, and that if we can do a good enough job making these platforms work that capture for immersive devices, as these ladies do, as well as consumption on phones, will continue to be like a huge thing for people.
Yeah, and just speaking to what Stephanie said, my role with the studio right now is the tech side is being figured out, but how can we make the story worth telling in these mediums? There's so much skepticism around VR 360 video, and rightfully so. The penetration rates for the headsets in the United States are low, and they're even much lower in the Middle East, in countries in Africa, in Asia, which we have a huge audience. So how do we figure out, this medium is there, how do we utilize it to tell the most compelling, the most powerful stories? How do we do justice to this medium by telling the stories that are best told in this, and maybe not in a 2D doc or a text article or using photographs?
Yeah, and I think like there's one way to say like, which is that content producers need to get better. But Facebook is a platform that serves like billions of people, and we're trying to encourage everyone to be an immersive creator. And so, for example, you can use your phone to take a panorama, and if you post that to Facebook, that's a 360 photo. And we can't expect just like the average person, like I don't expect my mom to like understand how to like frame immersive content. So I think you can look forward to us designing better tools to help creators and make everyone feel like an empowered creator in immersive content. Also, I want to point out too that I think that people, when they tend to think of like, why should I shoot something in 360 or immersive content, I think people tend to think like, I have to do it to tell the story of a place or do something like that. But we've actually found, so we have this tool on Facebook called Guide, where you can like basically choose scenes that are points of interest, and we'll generate like basically a guided tour throughout the video. And what some, for consumers, and what some filmmakers use this for is it's almost like shooting your video in RAW. So like when you think of like taking photos on your camera, if you shoot in RAW, you can then afterward tweak any setting. So like taking 360 is almost like shooting a video in RAW, and then afterward you can go and pick like which scenes you wanted people to be looking at. So people are like doing really interesting things with the format that are not necessarily like making full use of the space, but making use of the fact that like they're capturing everything at every angle, and so then they can go in and afterward figure out what the right story is or what was interesting about the scene.
So I actually think that that's like it's twofold though. I do think that, if we're going to be using 360 as a storytelling format, which it is, and that's the crazy thing is like we always talk about VR and 360 videos as if it's like this crazy concept, like new way of storytelling. But the thing is storytelling has been around since the beginning of time. This is just a new way to do it. And I think each medium has a very specific purpose and how it tells a story. And so I think the interesting thing right now is, like Stephanie, your team is developing really interesting tools, but by having a guide, how does that shape how people actually approach this medium as a storyteller? Because it's like if you're telling people where to look, you're taking away agency in a way. And like that's the whole point of 360 videos, that we have the agency to look wherever we want. And it's like, how can we tell stories while giving people that agency? At least in my opinion, I, again, totally respect the work that your team does.
Just to respond to that point specifically, I think that is like the biggest shortcoming of that product that I just described, is that like it's one perspective choosing where you should look, and there's no agency associated with it. And I agree with you, and I can't really speak too much to this, but we do think that this concept of being able to see the world through multiple perspectives is kind of a key to like getting this storytelling right, and that it's actually like about giving people more choice about who's telling the story or how they can experience the story in front of them. That's really going to be the magic of consuming this content, especially on devices where you don't have the full use of your gaze and periphery to like experience the content.
It's interesting because that goes right into my next question I want to ask you guys. It's how do you framework the story? So that's something that's a big question now in the journalistic world. How is there a formula? Is there some sort of way that we can tell this story? Which, Zahari, when you first tapped into it, I'd like for you guys to talk about how do you approach the storytelling, and what do you think, or what kind of steps are we taking to go into that proper way of doing that proper storytelling in 360 and VR?
To me, I felt like that was the biggest challenge when I started working in this medium. So I was with Riot, and then we got acquired by the Huffington Post, and one of our main mandates was how do you train the journalists at the Huffington Post to do 360 storytelling. And initially we had this open pitch process where anybody could just send us pitch ideas, or we had meetings and people would pitch us their ideas for 360 video. And almost every pitch that we went through, we were like, no, this doesn't work. This doesn't work in 360. This is just a better 2D documentary, or this is better in pictures. And I think that I don't think we have quite figured out what are the most powerful stories, or what's the most powerful way of storytelling within the medium. I think that as producers, we are still experimenting using in this medium to see that. But I did one doc for Riot, which was called Inside Trump's America. And to me, that was one piece that just made sense doing in the medium, because the idea was to take you to a Trump rally from the perspective of a minority. And it was a journey where you saw us driving to Wisconsin, which is where the rally was happening, and interacting with the protesters there and the supporters, the Trump supporters. And all of this was documented from my perspective. I was a correspondent in the piece. And it was the best way to make your audience, give the audience an experience of being there, while also, understanding how other people interact with a minority person at that event. And then it also gives you the sense of scale, the activity that's happening, all of the chants and the different things that were happening at that location. And to me, that was one film that just made sense doing in 360, of watching in a headset, because you actually wanted your audience to feel like they were there in order to get that complete experience.
Sandra?
Yeah, I would agree. I think because there is so much 360 in particular so much content because it's much easier and cheaper to produce than some of the room scale experiences. I feel like there's a lot of subject pieces and not a lot of story pieces. I mean, that don't differentiate between subject and story. And that if you just drop a camera and you sort of have the cool factor, but you're not really getting a sense of a story or a narrative unfolding. And I agree, like for me, the pieces that have moved me the most are first person or personal narratives, someone recounting an event or a memory or an experience, because the nature of the medium, to me, it lends itself to, it's immersive. So when you're immersed in another person's journey or story, it's very, very powerful. And so stories that I think pieces that try to do it in a traditional way with a narrator, especially journalistic pieces, don't really work as well to me. Yeah, so overall, though, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like, especially with things with like Live 360, where the person who's documenting can't really control what the narrative is, right? Like, it's just unbounded time and space. And especially just like in these times where like it's hard to interpret what the truth is and what the right story is, or even just like what you want to be looking at, because there's so much noise out there. To me, like the real power of this medium is the fact that we can give people choice in what they see and what they interpret and how they look at these events. So with Live 360 and like all these other things, like I really think that right now it just feels like too noisy, and there's so much content, and like on 360 videos on Facebook, one of the biggest issues is just people don't know where to look and how to follow what's going on. But I think that over time, like the magic will come when we can give people many ways, easy ways of following many stories, and that people will actually want to rewatch this content, maybe even more than like 2D video, because they can interpret it in new ways. I don't know if anyone's heard of the play Sleep No More. It's an experience in New York where basically you walk into this theater kind of setting, and basically you're a part of the play, and what you do is you follow different characters throughout, and you can only really choose a few different stories to follow, but it's interesting because if you go with a group of friends, you could all walk out and have an entirely different interpretation of what just happened. And the thing is, like, that's reality, right? Like, that's experiencing anything with like a group of friends. You go to a march or something like that, and everyone has their own perspective of what happened. And so I think the magic of 360 will be like that. You know, you get to choose your own perspective, or you can watch through anyone's eyes that you choose, or any sort of, there's just like many stories. So I actually think like the rewatching power of 360 and VR content is going to be, when we can nail that and nail the ability to give people multiple ways to choose how they watch, like that's going to be the real magic.
Jen,
And
did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just hopping off of Stephanie's point, and kind of taking a slightly different turn away from, you know, citizen journalism and journalistic documentary type works in VR. I think, you know, this is a universal medium. It's a universal language. We all experience things. And that's kind of what VR is. Every time someone describes a VR experience, they always say, oh, I experienced this, I experienced that. And I think, to Stephanie's point, it's one of those things where how can you craft a story that, and these are buzzwords, but everyone uses presence and immersion like literally like they're pennies. Like you can go to any VR conference and you'll just find hundreds of them because everyone's throwing out the words. But when we actually look at these words and their meanings and what that implies for VR, and it's like this idea of presence, to truly feel like you're in an alternative world or a different world and away from where you are presently, is a really powerful thing. And I think the way, at least the way I've been approaching that in our productions, not necessarily like our recap videos or our documentary work, but we're doing a lot of work more along the artistic side, is how can you create something that aesthetically and sonically complement each other, so much so that you feel completely swept away from the time you put on the headset till the time you take it off. And I think there's a lot to be said about how storytelling can happen there. Like we're about to release a VR music piece, and it's a music experience that takes 7 songs off of an album, and we created this overarching VR piece for it. But the entire through narrative line is actually driven by a poem that the artist wrote. And taking her poem in addition to her lyrics, we're able to create this really beautiful powerful, transformative experience because you see how she as an artist evolves throughout the piece. And what's really unique about that is it's not in a literal way. I wish I could like show you guys like stills of the sets, but like they're all very abstract sets, but you get the sense of the story that's being told just aesthetically. And I think that does that make sense? Sorry, I don't know if I'm rambling.
I think people are nodding. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, yeah, everyone's nodding for you.
This medium is the intersection of so many different things. We have technology, entertainment, games, live action theater, immersive theater, all kind of coming into one little tiny niche area thing that is called VR. And what I think storytellers should be looking at is, what did I like about film? What do I not like about film? What do I like about theater? What do I like about gaming? And what do I not like about these things? And take the things that you like, be aware of what you didn't like, and try to find your voice as a storyteller using those methods. I found that to be something really effective. Like, a lot of people will tell me how in films they really enjoy like how real these performances feel that are put on by the actors, and that everything is so stylized. And it's like, okay, if you like style, from theater, what you can take is intentional lighting and really create beautiful lighting scenes that create a stylized piece. Or in the documentary field, you can, a lot of people are like, seeing the realities of these different places was the most powerful, moving thing to me. And just by the nature of 360, we're able to see that, but it's also, it's bringing in so many different elements and really crafting a piece that allows you to feel like, oh, I get it. I've been there for a short time, but now I need to go travel to Africa. Now I need to go travel to the Syrian refugee camps and hopefully do something. And so, sorry, I'm losing train of thought, but yeah, basically do something about it.
Awesome. So now that we covered some of the framework, I think something that's been really important to kind of cover when it comes to the 360 VR, especially in a journalistic like media outlets, is at what point, how do we figure out how do we monetize this content? And how does that come into play also with live? Is that going to work? What are your thoughts on how we monetize the content that we create, and what can we expect from that? Stephanie?
Oh boy, all eyes on me, right? Yeah, I guess we're sort of the gatekeepers to a lot of this stuff, as Janice was talking about earlier. Yeah, like a lot of all publishers feel beholden to these giant companies as sort of like the gatekeeper to like, how are we going to make money in the future? And honestly, I don't have the answers, and I'm also not really allowed to talk about a lot of this stuff, but I do think that we're going to figure out new ways beyond like the traditional, for example, advertising format. I think there's going to be like perhaps more compelling ways to engage with this content. One thing that comes to mind is thinking about 360 as like a springboard for discovering other experiences. So if you think of sites like Pinterest, where they have like visual search, I think like 360 augments that in a totally different way, which is you can imagine going to into a 360 photo or in the headset or whatever, and say it's a photo of a store or some sort of location. I could imagine like you hot link different locations, and you can allow people to like fall into the rabbit hole of like discovering new things by experiencing a space. So that would be like sort of an innovative way of like approaching that, just new types of ad formats. I don't think everything else will quite entirely go away. I think that people will find experimental ways to create compelling advertisements in 360. And I think some brands have already started to do this. We've had a few good like car makers with like spatial audio and some interesting things. So that's the other thing too, is I would say thinking beyond visual is extremely important as well. So yeah, I think new ad formats and new ways of documenting ads. But then again, I work at an ads company, so I'm a little bit biased.
A lot of content right now, I believe that it's been a lot of branded content, right? A big company will come in and say, hey, we would really like to have this experience. Can you do like a VR or 360 story for us? Now, how do we transition out of that and make it more where the everyday creator can have some sort of, get back from their content. I think that's something that maybe within the next year or so to look into. Cassandra, what are your thoughts on?
I'm still trying to monetize my freelance career, so I'm not. That's not really. I mean, Emblematic does, branded. They do profit work to then help fund the immersive journalism side, sort of, which is the common model, right? And then the rest of it is grant funded. So I mean, the project we're doing with Frontline, we're doing 3 virtual reality films, is funded by the Knight Foundation, which is great. So I just hope those revenue streams continue. Thanks.
Zara?
It's the same thing that Cassandra mentioned. News organizations are having a really tough time figuring out what monetization looks like. And in my experience with 2 different news companies, I've seen that the branded content is what people are using more and more in order to fund their more editorial content.
Jen?
Well, I think outside of that, I think the way companies are now approaching content is a little bit different, especially with VR, because now you have marketing budgets to tap into. You can do live activations, and especially not all indie content creators are able to do this, but it's like, I think finding production companies or even experiential companies, and oftentimes I'm finding that they're starting to become hybrids, that you can make a piece and then activate it by selling it to a brand, going like, oh, if I made a piece for this and this, like a brand like Red Bull would totally get behind this. And then next thing you know, Red Bull's dropping $200,000 to activate that content at some festival, or that's just an example. And you can use that money to also fund making the content. So that's another interesting thing that I don't think we've quite seen in traditional.
I also think too, just because no one's mentioned it, I think I wouldn't underestimate like the Netflix model. So I think that like we will see more of these like larger, the Disneys of the world enter into this type of production as like a mainstay. So even like I just saw It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, that TV show produced some VR content, and I think we'll see more of that, and you'll see consumers like directly paying for that type of content if people move into the realm of movies and shows and entertainment like that. So I can imagine that happening as well.
Yeah. And like to hop off of Stephanie's point, it's also like the higher quality of the content. So I think that's what's lacking right now is we have a lot of VR content. There's a couple of 100,000 360 cameras floating out there, and people will just randomly post stuff that they kind of just stuck a camera up for. But as content companies and production companies start making these higher end experiences, that's what's going to really build the Jaunt library or the Little Star library. And even there's a company called Weaver based out of Venice. A couple months ago, it was like sometime last year, they announced their platform Transport. And it was a couple months ago that they started putting a subscription model to Transport. So for like $3 a month, you could get access to all of the 360 videos. And then for like $6 a month, you get access to all the 360 videos in addition to the room scale experiences. So it's really interesting to see smaller companies trying to pave the way in that sense. But definitely Netflix HBO model is a thing.
Awesome. So we're just a little bit over the halfway mark, so I wanted to kind of open up to see if anyone had any questions in the audience.
Beyond 360, maybe thinking about Facebook Live in general and other video, I wanted to hear if any of you have had success with advertising on live video and or on video in general, or even 360. And if not you, if there are some examples, some great examples of publishers who you believe are doing an excellent job of monetizing and finding advertising sponsors, and who maybe some of the brands are that are interested in advertising maybe on 360 video, Facebook Live, or other forms of video.
Monetization is still, it's still something that we're all figuring out. But what we're starting to see is people experimenting in terms of ads. A really good example is Hulu recently launched a 360 show. I forgot. It's like specifically focused on music. But then it was really interesting. And I don't know who facilitated the deal in terms of like companies involved. But all of a sudden now 50 Shades of Grey, that VR experience is kind of attached as like the pre-roll to the Hulu music experience. And that's definitely kind of like a permanent ad. So you're seeing companies do that. But what's also really interesting is I think how 360 is going to change the ad landscape is because we already said it. Branded work is most of the work that's coming through most production companies' doors nowadays. And that, whatever piece of content that brand walks away from, that is now an advertisement for them indefinitely, whether that's at an activation. And now I think we're going to see, it's kind of going back to these physical advertisements like the billboards and whatnot. It's not just necessarily digital. And I think those campaigns tend to resonate with people more because it's a memorable experience. I don't really think that answered her question, but I tried.
Anyone else?
I actually haven't seen any ads within 360 videos yet, but from the editorial perspective, what we've done in the past is that we've collaborated if there is a story that we want to work on a series that we're doing, and we think that we can find a good partner, a brand partner, who might be able to fund that. Then we work with them either on their product or on their idea to incorporate that part of the story. So last year we did the Rio Olympics, and we collaborated with Samsung, who funded the series because their idea was that these cameras are easy to use and take any place, any part of the world, easy to capture, and we covered the Olympics in different, like smaller, the unwatched or unheard parts of Brazil. And so that just fit with their brand and what they were trying to do with their cameras and the kind of storytelling we wanted to do in 360. So that's that's where most of the revenue we're seeing right now come from, at least for the news organizations or news studios.
I'm really interested to see the Inside Trump piece that you made, and I was curious about your role in it, because you are the subject and also the journalist. Mm-hmm. And what were your thoughts? How did you react or approach it? And then the other twist is that the viewers get to experience it as if they're you. Mm-hmm. So did you feel like you wanted to make commentary, or did you feel like you wanted to just be quiet?
Coming from a really strict journalistic background, that was a conscious decision to put myself within that film, only because that was the best way for the audience to experience that event in that medium. And so the idea was not to provide commentary as much as to give them a window into what I was experiencing while I was there. But then on the other side, I was also acting as a journalist because I went and I interviewed people. So I asked them about what they thought about Trump's views on Muslims, and so it was a chance for people to get a first-hand experience into how others around you would react to me. I found that it was actually a lot more immersive than I had envisioned it, only because you actually got a sense of journey in that documentary. It was, us traveling, and then people coming up to me, talking to me acting as a journalist, interviewing them, and then going. The video ends with us actually seeing Trump talk, and the way we term it is gonzo journalism, more like, it's journalism with sort of an opinion. I don't want to say it's completely objective because it's not. I've made certain decisions to be there in that situation to ask specific questions. So I don't know. I would love to hear what you think after you watch that piece.
Did you call it, I'm sorry, I missed the word console?
Gonzo journalism, yeah. It's like
Gonzo.
Gonzo.
Okay, yeah, it sounds fascinating.
It's the journalism from the first person perspective, right? Yeah.
I think, Vera, did you have a question? No. Oh, are we? Okay. Well, it looks like it's that time. If I can do one more question, Vera, I think it's really important that. So we're at a women's conference, and I had the pleasure of having an all-women's panel on VR, and it brings me no greater joy to be able to do this. And thank you. And you're seeing some of the best in the industry right here at the table and in the screen behind us. But the reality of it is, I'd like for you guys to discuss the obstacles that we face as women in VR storytelling, immersive storytelling, because there's lots of moments and lots of events and lots of things that happened throughout the last few years where you will see an all-male panel, or you will see the experts being men, and that representation of the women in leadership within this niche field is not really represented. So if you have your own personal experience, I'd like to see if you would like to talk about that, or what we can do as a community of women in VR, what kind of steps we can take to kind of combat this in the upcoming year.
For me, like one thing that's strange about these, I get asked to do a lot of these types of panels, and it's hard for me to believe that I'm a VR designer, but especially a female VR and designer, like I know that I'm one of the 1% people who does this. And one thing that we try and do on my team, and I'm lucky that our head of social VR is actually a woman, and we have like a solid contingency of women on our team, but not so much in fields like engineering and some of our other operations. And so one thing that I try and make a point of with my team is one, just ways of little representation. So we try as much as possible to ensure that like gender ratios and things like mocks, like when we post like screenshots for products and things, that we include a lot of women. That's like something that I personally patrol. The other thing is like when we go to conferences and events, we're not always super successful about this, but we do try and make sure that there are a solid contingency of women there. Because the truth is that like most of these experiences are not designed from the female perspective, and I think that's going to be something that that's like causing debt now in these products, which is that like you see a lot of these experiences that skew male in some ways, and you can't quite describe why, but they just don't feel so welcoming as a woman. And so that's one thing that I try and personally patrol, but I know that it's something that like we need to do better as a collective community. And so I think that supporting events like Women in VR are important, but I do think that as much as possible, like bringing men to these types of conversations, and that's why I'm so excited to see the men out there. Like I think like as much as like these events are great for women to talk with each other, I think like it's almost more important to bring allies into the room as much as possible.
Cassandra?
Yeah, I think especially what Stephanie was saying in the area of engineers, sort of the tech section at Emblematic, Nani, it's one of her like founding principles is to have a lot of women represented in the company, and it's much harder to do that when it comes to engineers and designers. And I also think from a storytelling perspective, I'm an example. I haven't been steeped in VR for years. Not that it's a very new medium, obviously, but I'm involved in directing and sort of interfacing with largely, let's say male, engineers and designers, and so therefore able though to put my own voice and style on it, and it's completely possible to do that. So even if you come, I think, from a different medium, it's welcoming people in creatively to that conversation. And I think also just being conscious of that. I've found it really interesting. Nani is a pioneer in this field, and I've been to events and things where it's all male panels, or where she's not even noted as someone, and when she is noted, it's very striking to me. And that's just one example, because she's someone who was doing the storytelling very early on, and there weren't a lot of women doing that. So I think just repeating those stories and keeping those conversations alive are really important for the history of the medium as it moves forward.
Zahra?
I think I have a threefold challenge, at least I've had since I started in this industry. One is working at the intersection of tech and media. There aren't a lot of women. Secondly, I'm a woman of color, which is even more complex part of this industry. And the third one is I'm a Muslim woman of color, which I think is, has its own challenges. And so I found it. What I do is, now that in my previous job working as managing editor and now as the editorial lead, whenever I'm doing stories, I make sure from the editorial perspective, I have people who are working on those stories who are represented in those groups. So we're doing a documentary in Nigeria, and one of the basic requirements for the director of this documentary is that the director needs to be Black. I'm not going to take a white director to Nigeria to tell the story, because I'm conscious that then we're going to reiterate those stereotypes that we have about Nigeria, about the African continent. when we're going to Bangladesh to do a story about the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims. And it takes a lot of effort. It's not easy to find people who have that voice and who come from those communities to be able to own their narratives and tell their own stories. But I think as somebody who realizes and who's faced these challenges, who realizes this is an issue, I take a lot of efforts to reach out to the network that I have, to find and then put together a group of people who then we can then share so that those people are able to get more opportunities and are better represented within the storytelling space.
Jen?
I have so many thoughts on this. Women in VR is something that since Julie and I started it, I literally wake up thinking about this group and I go to sleep thinking about this group. And I'll wake up in the middle of the night and check on the group. But I think it's one, we discovered this thing called the invitation effect. The Women in VR Facebook group is actually 80% female, 20% male, because we strongly believe that this idea of feminism really just means equality. And so part of that was we wanted, because it's this intersection and because there's already less females than males, it's like we wanted to make sure women felt welcomed. And oftentimes when they see a group that's overwhelmingly full of women with supportive male allies, they do feel welcomed. And we found that to be incredibly successful. But at the same time, it is, I think it was Stephanie who said this, Stephanie or Cassandra, is one of you guys, making sure that, we all check our privilege, not just men, but also women. And I think what that means is we all come from very different backgrounds, but when we come together for constructive conversations like this, we can oftentimes take this and talk to our peers. And I think that's the most important thing. It's always the issue with, panels being called women in VR panels or et cetera, because oftentimes the people that are in the audience aren't necessarily the people that you need to be reaching out to. But what we have found is, through our talks and through educating a lot of male men in positions of power, so I'm trying to make sure I word this very properly, that we've really pushed, you have to actively seek diverse hires. It's going to be more difficult. The candidate pool is smaller, but science has shown and research has shown that your company will do better if you have a diverse leadership team. And a lot of the times people will say like, oh, well, we can't find a woman that's qualified. Then it's like, okay, then this points to the larger issue of the pipeline in general, that women and minorities aren't getting in at these entry-level jobs. And then they aren't being, because they're not getting in at the entry level, they aren't getting enough experience to the mid-level and then to the management level. So it's also like, make sure that you're hiring at the entry level and seeking these diverse hires. But once you hire them, make sure that you have an inclusive culture. It's not just like diversity and inclusion aren't synonymous. And I feel like a lot of times people make them synonymous, and we have to realize that they're not, and then approach them as two separate pillars of an overall issue. I could literally go on for hours about this, but I will say this to all the women in the room: if you're interested in immersive storytelling, know that this is a medium for you. And this is a medium where you're welcomed and one that you can and will thrive in if you choose to. And clearly there are a ton of great women right below me. I see my little fingers right now, that are killing it in the space. And there's a Facebook group with 5,000 of us in it. So just know that you're always welcome and you always have a home here.
Awesome. I can't imagine a better way to end our conversation. So thank you, Jen, for joining us. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Zahra. Thank you all for joining us.